Hi, I'm glad you could join me in my study. As we've surveyed the history of thought about the doctrine of the atonement, we've repeatedly seen how often the secondary literature gets it wrong with regard to classic theories of the atonement. I've been startled to see how seriously misrepresented thinkers like Ransom, Abelard, and Hugo Grotius are in the secondary literature. But I thought that everyone agreed about the early church fathers. The secondary literature is unanimous in portraying the view of the early church fathers as the ransom theory of the atonement. Well, this week I read a remarkable article by Joseph Mitros called The Patristic Views of Christ's Salvific Work. And this has completely upended my impression of what the church fathers taught. It turns out that the ransom theory is just one aspect of the church fathers' thinking about the atonement and not even the most important. It turns out that the church fathers held to the view of Christ's atonement as a sacrificial death, vicarious, substitutional suffering on our part, that he was our sin bearer so that we do not need to bear the punishment of sins ourselves. For example, listen to what Origen wrote about penal substitution. He says, "What has never been related in any history is that one suffered death for the whole world, and that the whole world was cleansed by this sacrifice. Whereas without such a sacrifice, it must perforce have perished. Christ could only receive on the cross the burden of the sins of all. He took on him our sins and was smitten for our iniquities. The punishment awaiting us fell on him instead. We are healed by the sufferings of his cross. His Father delivered him for our misdeeds. He was led to the slaughter for the sins of the people." This is a statement of penal substitution. Moreover, Gregory Nazianzus expresses the idea of the imputation of our sins to Christ. Listen to what Gregory of Nazianzus said. "Just as he became a curse and sin for my salvation, he made himself into a second Adam in the stead of the old. He took unto himself and made his own our rebellion as the head of the whole body. On the cross, it was not he who was forsaken. He occupied our own position. We it was who were abandoned and despised. He saved us by his sufferings, for he made our sins his own." John Chrysostom says something very similar. He gives this analogy. "A king, seeing a robber about to receive his due, sends his beloved and only son to death, and lays on him not only the penalty, but also the crime. And this he does to save the guilty one and to promote him afterwards to high dignity. Men ought to have been punished, but God did not do so. Instead, he gave his son in their place." Here, Chrysostom compares Christ to someone who takes the place of a robber and receives the punishment that the robber deserves. And more than that, the wrongdoing of the robber is imputed to the son instead. This is a description of the imputation of sins and penal substitution. So, the author of this article says, by way of summary, one may say that the sacrificial theory of salvation, combined with the idea of penal substitution, constituted the main stream of thinking in the East in the 4th century. And the motif of the Isaianic servant of Yahweh made up its commonly accepted background. Though innocent himself, Christ, the Son of God, took upon himself our sins and accepted the punishment due to us for them. By becoming man, the new Adam, he had become the representative of all men. Then, as a high priest and victim, in offering his life as a propitiatory sacrifice, Christ reconciled men to God. This, he says, was the dominant view in the East. What about the Latin West? He goes on to say the same thought patterns concerning the sacrificial character of Christ's death were in vogue in the West in the 4th century. However, this was a much greater emphasis placed on them in the Latin West than in the Greek East. Thus, Christ saved us by his passion, death, and resurrection. He freely offered his Father a perfect sacrifice of propitiation for us in order to abolish the sentence of death passed against us, to forgive our sins, and to reconcile us to God. He says this is a substantially accurate summary of the teaching common to Hilary, Victorinus, Ambrose, and Ambrosiaster. So that in both the East and in the West, the dominant motif was vicarious suffering on the part of Christ for our sins. This is penal substitution. So while the church fathers did hold to the ransom theory of Christ, this was merely one facet, one aspect of their theory, and not even the most important. And this puts a completely different light, I think, on the teaching of the church fathers with regard to the atonement. It turns out that the principal motif and a central facet of their views was, in fact, penal substitution.